Hello there, you're watching the press preview, a first look at what's on the front pages as they arrive. In the next half hour, we'll see what's making the headlines with the political commentator Benedict Spence and the Observer's chief leader writer Sonia Sodha. Welcome both. So let's see what is on some of those front pages. Well, The Times reports that Labour will promise a big expansion of childcare, including plans to create thousands of new nursery places. The Mirror looks ahead to the budget on March the 6th. Their assessment, Rishi helps the rich get richer. The Guardian leads with an admission from a senior Metropolitan Police officer that victims of domestic abuse have lost trust in the force. According to the Financial Times, the world's biggest defense companies have seen an increase of more than 10% in the orders being made to them in the last 2 years, with the war in Ukraine cited as the main reason. The Eye reports that hundreds of homes, which their owners were forced to sell to make way for an high-speed rail line between Birmingham and Manchester that was never completed, are now being rented out and making their landlords an estimated profit of £9 million a year. The front page of the Daily Mail is about the plan for inheritance tax cuts, reporting that the Chancellor will use them to underline the political divide with Labour. The Star leads on the travel chaos caused by Storm Garrett. And a reminder that by scanning the QR code that you see on your screen during the programme, you can check out the front pages of tomorrow's papers while you watch us. And we are joined tonight, as I mentioned, by Benedict Spence and Sonia Sodha. So welcome both. Let's start with this news of the budget. We now have a date, spring budget, March 6th. Let's take a quick look at the FT. A lot of papers have it obviously on their front pages. Here it's a budget set for March 6th. Everyone's saying that, well, some people implying that this could be a sign that perhaps we're going to get a spring election. Benedict, do you think we're going to get a spring election?
I'm not sure we are going to get a spring election, because I think that what you're going to see is that the budget is going to be framed in a very sort of big, this is a couple of months away still, and here it comes, it's coming down the line, almost like some sort of big film release, building up the anticipation, because so much of what has gone before has been just a damp squib from the Conservatives for so long. They've failed to sort of grasp the imagination of the public. They've got one last chance. I'm not even really sure if it is a last chance, to be honest, but one last chance to kind of get a message across. But then they're inevitably going to need a bit of time to sort of let people know that it's working, because I think the one thing that we would probably all agree on is that actually most members of the public, whatever they hear from the government, they just go, yeah, well, you've been saying that for however long, you've been in power for 13 years, it's not going to happen. So I'm not convinced it's going to be early. It could be. I mean, there might be something that they spring on us and they go, but you can only have it if you vote for it now. But, we wait and see. I suspect it'll probably be later in the year.
Sonia?
I agree with that. I think what they're doing, I mean, there was always going to be a budget in spring anyway. And, the Conservatives have been trailing these tax cuts, which we're going to go on to talk about what some of them might potentially be. But I think by having the budget in early March, the government is leaving themselves time to go for, an April potentially, or more likely a May election, and to have some of those announcements land. I think it's very unlikely, though, so I think they're leaving them space to do that, just in case there's a change in the political mood and their position in the polls change. But I think it's very unlikely. I think it's psychologically very difficult to go for an early election when you are as far behind in the polls as the Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak, currently is. So I would be very surprised. But I think they're just giving themselves maximum leeway for just in case they have this budget and it starts to change things, and then, they decide to go for a spring election. It leaves that option open. But like Benedict, I don't think it's going to happen.
And let's look at some of the things that might be planned. So front page of the Daily Mail, because it's all about inheritance tax, basically. Front page of the Mail, Hunt plan to slash death tax by half. And then if we look at the Mirror, different take. Rishi helps the rich get richer. There it is, the Mirror. So, a lot of talk around inheritance tax, a lot of talk around helping first-time buyers. So I guess perhaps the government trying to appeal to all sorts of different groups of voters.
Yeah, so will they, won't they? There's been this big debate about inheritance tax, and certain Conservatives are very keen for inheritance tax to be scrapped, and which is why I think you're seeing some people brief it into the papers. What that Mirror headline is referring to is when you look at the substance of it, inheritance tax is only paid by 3.7% of estates on death. So it's a tax that very few people end up paying. A tax cut, so if you were to scrap it altogether, which is certainly being talked about, analysis by the IFS, the Institute for Fiscal Studies, suggests that half of this tax cut would go to estates worth £2.1 million or more, and the average tax cut would be 1.1 million. 90% of estates, they're just, that people are never going to see the benefit, yet abolishing it would leave a huge hole in the budget of 7 billion going up to 10 billion in a few years' time. What the Conservatives will be gambling on is that it's a very unpopular tax, even though so few people end up paying it, because people are worried they might end up paying it. They see it as a tax on aspiration, on passing things on to your kids. So that is what the gamble is. But I think it is fundamentally, wealth is under tax in this country already compared to income. It is fundamentally the wrong thing to do.
I mean, this is the thing, up until now, not many people have paid it. But, and the Tories know this very well because this is their voter base, a quarter of pensioners now live in households that will become eligible to pay this in a very short space of time. And I think that that does sort of focus the mind rather a lot on people who perhaps aren't necessarily just voting, thinking about this current election, but future elections to come. Because it's correct to point out that actually, wealth hasn't been taxed properly in this country. There's a dreadful sort of concentration of it at the top end of society, and that has benefited pensioners in particular very well by also not building enough houses. But now a lot of pensioners might well be starting to look to their grandchildren or children, for example, and saying, well, what can I potentially do to help those people get on the ladder? And it might actually then counterintuitively prove very popular to say, well, actually, we want to give as much as we can to people lower down on the rungs. There is also just that fact that a lot of people do just feel fundamentally that it's not very fair that you're taxed throughout your life, and then on top of that, the government might come along and take another chunk right at the end. So even people who don't pay it, I think, fundamentally feel that it doesn't sit right with them.
I suppose the fundamental question is whether you think Rishi Sunak can do anything to turn the fortunes of the Conservatives around.
I mean, I think that's a very good question. And for me, you should never write anything off in politics, but it is very, very difficult to see how the Prime Minister can turn this around, because fundamentally the next election, I think, is going to be fought on the state of the economy and what people have experienced over the last 13 years in terms of cost of living crisis, what's happened to their household budgets. You can't turn that around in a year. Inflation might fall. Well, that very high inflation that we saw a year ago, inflation of 10%, that's baked in. People are paying more for things and their wages are not going as far, and we've not seen real wage growth.
But we have to say it might simply be a sort of a sabotage election, if you like. If things are that bad for the Conservatives, they think, well, how can we make things as difficult for the Labour Party as possible? And I think the Labour Party understands that. You see that in the very cautious way, actually, that they're not promising people the earth. They recognise the country's in a very bad state. But let's take inheritance tax, for example. As I've just said, a quarter of pensioner households at some point soon will be eligible to be paying that. Well, that's rather a lot of income, potentially, for a Labour government that it might actually be looking forward to in the next 5 to 10 years that the Conservatives could potentially get rid of. So right there, they're creating, this isn't necessarily done with the best intentions of the country, but they're creating a very difficult situation where they're saying to the Labour Party, well, you're not going to be able to have that income, and if you try to reverse that policy, well, that's going to make you very unpopular for the next 5 years.
Which takes us to the front page of The Times, which actually mentions Labour, and it says Labour will promise big expansion on childcare, so they're offering nursery places. So, Sonia, first of all, I guess Labour has to prepare for a snap election. I mean, they're not going to know, but they have to be ready. And what do we know about this specific promise?
Well, they've been making very positive noises about childcare over the last year. Over the last year. So we know it's an area they're interested in. It's an area that working parents are very interested in because in the UK, we've got some of the most expensive childcare in Europe. Some really shocking figures, actually, in this Times report, which is that Labour have done some analysis that shows that in some areas of the country, like in Sunderland, for example, there are only 12 childcare places for every 100 children under the age of 5. We all know, I'm sure, stories of how expensive expensive it is to get childcare, parents who literally cannot afford it, parents who cannot find places. And we've got an issue with employment in this country as well, where too many people are out of work. And the fact of the matter is, investing in early years childcare, it's good for children because they do better, particularly children from disadvantaged backgrounds, if they've had that education in the early years. It's better for families because it helps them do better economically. And also it's better for the economy because we've got too many parents who are out of work because they can't find childcare. So it's a bit of a no-brainer policy from Labour. The question will be, how are you going to get these extra childcare places and how much funding will they require up front? There's something in the Times report suggesting that they will be attached to primary schools, which will be very popular with parents, but that will obviously require some sort of start-up funding.
But I guess Labour is going to need policies, obviously, for the year ahead.
Yeah, absolutely. And to be fair, we've seen them come up with they're in a tricky spot because they can't, as Benedict was just saying, they can't promise the earth. They've got some really tight spending rules that they say they're going to stick to. But they have produced a fair few policies already. For example, on early years, they're going to be investing money into breakfast clubs, for example. So all children get access to free breakfast clubs. Quite a cheap policy, but a very effective policy, if you look at the education evidence. So I think we can be expecting to see more of these, but the tricky thing for them is, public services are in a state now where they require investment. They say they will raise the money for that through economic growth. I think the question is, what if you can't get economic growth without investing up front in things like the NHS and childcare?
OK. And Benedict, do you think a lot of this is actually cutting through with the electorate?
I think it will, to a demographic that is already going to probably vote Labour at the next general election. I think that this is simply rewarding them. But it's also a morally good thing to do because actually I'd say broader than everything, it's a civilisational issue. Actually, when you talk to young people, they talk about not being able to get on the housing ladder, not being able to afford childcare, and that is preventing them from having children. That causes a demographic bomb at some point, as several other countries, developed countries, are saying. So this is long-term care. We need to look at it in those terms. Making sure that people are able to have children in the first place is vitally important. And I do feel, ironically, the Conservatives, all supposed to be about nuclear families and what have you, they've completely left that by the wayside. Their record on housing, on childcare. This is something where Labour could do a lot of good, especially seeing as it anticipates it probably will win the next election. It can afford to be quite unpopular on things like housing policies, but this is something that I think you're right, will be quite popular, whatever way you spin it.
Benedict and Sonia, thank you for now. Stay with us, of course. It's reported that the Home Secretary will not face disciplinary action from the Prime Minister over his joke about drink spiking. We'll discuss that next. Welcome back. You're watching the Press Preview. With me now, Benedict Spence and Sonia Sodha. OK, let's go to the Mirror, page 6. This story that broke a couple days ago, and it's about the Home Secretary, and the Prime Minister is not going to act over James Cleverly's spiking joke. Now, this is a slightly off-colour joke that he made about spiking his own wife's drink. What do you make of the fact, Sonia, A, of the joke itself, and B, the fact that the Prime Minister isn't going to do anything about it?
Well, it doesn't surprise me that the Prime Minister is standing by the Home Secretary because, he's lost quite a few Home Secretaries of late. But I do think that this joke was in appalling taste. I'm not somebody who gets easily offended, if someone's making a joke, and jokes are made in political circles. We've all been to dinners, we've heard them, but I think this joke was particularly inappropriate because it's about a crime, and a particularly terrible crime. Spiking a drink with Rohypnol. The Home Secretary was joking about it, kind of in relation to his wife, and I just think it sends a terrible signal. Spiking is a really serious crime. We've got a massive issue with male violence against women and girls.
And they just made an announcement about it as well.
Absolutely. And, tone matters. And tone matters in terms of young men in this country and boys and thinking about their attitudes to women and girls. So I personally think that this does really matter. I think it was an appalling taste. And I think it's right for politicians through other parties to be calling it out.
Benedict, he did apologise, though, almost straight away. So what do you think?
I think, obviously the apology is very important, that he didn't waste any time, no prevarication, anything like that. I think the fact that the Prime Minister hasn't necessarily seen fit to do anything about it, it might be because behind closed doors, privately, James Cleverly has been very apologetic. It may be because they don't want to draw too much attention to it. It may also, though, be, you know, we hear stories, don't we, all the time about how Rishi Sunak is on thin ice. Well, if you were sort of look around and think, well, who might be a good challenger to Rishi Sunak, there aren't that many, but I suspect James Cleverly would probably be one. So actually having somebody like that being, you know, potentially very gaffe-prone, as in your corner, so to speak, because you haven't reprimanded him for making a joke, might be more sensible than, you know, going in two-footed, so to speak.
But beyond that, as Sonia mentioned, can't really have another Home Secretary again, can we?
I think we just sort of assume now that when you're in the Home Office, bad things are going to happen to you. It's cursed, and that's just the way that it is. I mean, you know, we're waiting. The last person to come out of it successfully was Theresa May, and then she suffered throughout her premiership. So I think you just need to look at it as being a very cursed thing. But a year, maybe till the next general election, potentially less. I mean, who knows? We could have a new Home Secretary. Why not? Any names that you want to, like, throw up? I mean, who fancies some pain for the next 6 months? Let's see.
I'll tell you what, let's leave that hanging and go to the Financial Times front page there. Global defence order books bulge as Ukraine puts budgets on war footing. So basically, a lot of defence firms are seeing a spike in their orders because of the war in Ukraine.
Yes, 10% higher. I think that's what the FT says. And what this piece says, it points out, is that very often you will see things, as it were, backlogged after a war has broken out. Is that actually it's only then that you start to see people ramping up their spending. It is concerning, though, obviously, when you have a $760 billion extra dollars worth of equipment sort of being ordered. But let's be very clear, we were put on notice some years ago, actually. NATO countries in particular were put on notice that they needed to be pulling their weight far more when it comes to defence. Russia was very clear, actually, about what it wanted to do. China has been very clear, actually, what its long-term intentions are. And you notice, actually, who it is that's putting in the orders. It's countries like Poland, it's the Eastern European countries, it's countries that stand potentially to lose the most if conflicts continue to break out, as they're likely to do. You know, war doesn't just go away because we all fancy that it will. And when you've got major powers actively saying what it is that they plan on doing, or even smaller powers like Venezuela saying, we will invade Guyana at some point, you do have to take it seriously. So it makes a lot of sense that countries are starting to put these orders in.
Sonia?
Yeah, I think I agree with all of that. It feels like times have really changed, and you know, one in terms of global conflict, and one place that we're seeing that is in these sorts of budgets. So yeah.
Yeah. Let's take a look now at the Star, front page of the Star, and Storm Gerrit, which is causing travel chaos. I don't know whether that's the A9, but certainly the A9 in Scotland had people stuck there for hours and hours, and it's almost a Christmas tradition, isn't it?
Well, I think it's just the worst timing possible, really. So just as people are on the move after Christmas, spending Christmas with their families, trying to get around the country, the storm has sort of put a stop to that. You know, I've got a friend who's sort of stuck up in Cumbria because there weren't any trains running south today. There's the motorways. Apparently, Bristol Airport, one plane had to attempt to landing 3 times because it was so windy. It was quite interesting, actually. Some of the news reports say that the Met Office deliberately named this storm because one of the reasons that they named the storm is because of the impact it will have on the country, not just, you know, its weather measurements. And they wanted to be clear with people, this is quite a serious storm that's going to have a big impact on travel plans, particularly during a holiday period. So that's why they decided to name it. But it's pretty appalling timing, I think, for people who are trying to move around the country after Christmas.
Yeah. Sonia, Benedict, thanks for that. And we'll, of course, see you in the next hour. Let's take a look at the weather now.